30 years is 10,957 nights. That is how many times Loretta Voss pulled back the curtain on the front window of her house on Sycamore Lane in Harlan, Kentucky, and looked out at the road her son had walked down one October evening in 1989 and never come back from. She did it when it was raining. She did it during ice storms, when the road glazed silver and the streetlight at the corner threw shadows across the empty pavement. She did it on Christmas Eve, Thanksgiving, the 4th of July, and every other night that was supposed to mean something. She became a woman who lived by windows. Neighbors would see her there, the curtain open an inch, her face still, her eyes on the road. 30 years. Her son's name was Dale Voss. He was 22 years old when he disappeared on the night of October 11th, 1989. He was a mine equipment technician at the Harlan County Surface Operation, the youngest crew lead they'd ever promoted, a young man who fixed things with his hands and remembered everyone's birthday and called his mother every Sunday morning without fail. He had a plan. He had a girl he was going to marry. He had a paycheck in his back pocket from that morning, and he was going to cash it on the way home. He never made it to the bank. What investigators would eventually discover, after 30 years, 2 cold case reviews, and a single piece of evidence that had been waiting in a county evidence locker since 1993, would answer the question that had kept Loretta at that window every night of her adult life. It would name the man responsible, and it would reveal that the truth had never been far away. It had been there, in plain sight, in the town where Dale grew up, the whole time. But to understand how Dale Voss disappeared, you first have to understand the world he came from, because Harlan County in 1989 was a place with its own particular kind of honor, and what happened to Dale cut against everything that community believed about itself. Harlan County, Kentucky, sits in the southeastern corner of the state, cradled by the Cumberland Mountains, a place where the ridgelines rise steep on every side and the valleys between them fill with towns that grew up around the coal industry, the way plants grow toward water. By 1989, the big underground mines had been closing for years, but the surface operations, strip mining, equipment maintenance, hauling, still employed half the county, and the men and women who worked them understood their value the way you understand something you have spent your whole life depending on. Dale Voss had grown up on Sycamore Lane in a 2-bedroom house his father had built in 1961. His father, Raymond, had worked the mines his whole life and came home every day with coal dust in the creases of his hands that never fully washed out. Raymond died of a lung condition in 1984 when Dale was 17, and after that it was Dale and Loretta and Dale's younger sister Pam, who was 15 that year and looked enough like her brother that strangers sometimes mistook them for twins. Dale had been working at the Harlan surface operation since he was 19. He had a natural aptitude for machinery, could hear when something was off in an engine the way some people hear a wrong note in music, just a slight wrongness in the sound that nobody else caught until something broke. His supervisor, a man named Hollis Crace, told the county paper years later that Dale Voss was the best young technician he had ever trained. He said it mattered to him that people knew that. Outside of work, Dale was what Harlan called a fixture. He played pickup basketball Tuesday nights at the high school gym. He sang in the choir at First Baptist, a low baritone that the choir director relied on to anchor the left side. He drove an '82 Ford pickup with a cracked taillight he kept meaning to fix, and he kept a photograph of his mother tucked into the sun visor, which she had found once when he left his truck keys and discovered it there, still in its place. He was engaged to a woman named Cecily Marsh, who taught 3rd grade at Harlan Elementary and wore her dark hair pulled back every weekday, but let it down on weekends in a way that Dale said was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They were going to marry the following June. The venue was already booked, the fellowship hall at First Baptist, which Loretta had reserved the moment Cecily said yes. On the morning of October 11th, 1989, Dale came down to breakfast in his work clothes, ate the eggs his mother made, poured coffee into his thermos, and kissed Loretta on the cheek. She told him she'd have pot roast ready by 6. He said he'd be home by 5:30. He picked up his lunch pail and walked out the front door and down Sycamore Lane toward the bus stop at the corner. He was 22 years old. He weighed 180 pounds. He had his paycheck in his back pocket, his name written in the memo line in the bookkeeper's careful hand. That was the last morning Loretta Voss would ever make him breakfast. The shift ended at 4:30. Dale collected his check from the front office, said goodbye to Hollis Crace and 2 other crew members in the parking lot, and left the operation site on foot, heading toward the First Harlan Savings Bank on Cumberland Avenue, which closed at 5 o'clock. Witnesses confirmed he left the lot at approximately 4:41 p.m. He never arrived at the bank. The teller who handled his account confirmed he had not come in that day. At 5:30, Loretta started watching the lane. At 6:15, she called the operation site. Nobody answered. At 7 o'clock, she called Cecily, who hadn't heard from him since that morning. At 8, she called the Harlan County Sheriff's Office. The deputy who took her call advised her to wait. Grown men sometimes lost track of time, he said. She told him Dale called every Sunday without fail and had never once been late for pot roast. The deputy took down the information. By the following morning, when Dale still had not appeared and had not called and had not been seen by anyone, the Harlan County Sheriff's Office opened a missing persons case. The lead investigator was a deputy named Gerald Stamper, who had worked Harlan County for 14 years and had the careful, unhurried manner of a man who understood that finding the truth sometimes required more patience than urgency. They retraced the route from the mine site to the bank. The distance was 9/10 of a mile on Eastover Road, a straight 2-lane that passed the feed store, the gas station, and the lot behind the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall, which was mostly gravel and sat partly screened from the road by a row of overgrown arbor vitae. 3 people who had been at the VFW that afternoon were interviewed. One of them, a retired miner named Hector Blanton, said he had seen a blue pickup truck parked at the far end of the lot around 4:45. He couldn't say whose truck it was. He noticed it because it was idling, engine running, nobody visible inside. Nobody had written down the plates. Nobody had thought anything of it. Dale's paycheck was never cashed. It was never found. The county searched the surrounding hillsides for 10 days. Volunteers covered the creek beds and the service roads that threaded through the mining territory east of town. The state police assisted for 4 days before reassigning their personnel. By the end of October, the physical search had been suspended. The case remained open, technically, but the leads had run dry in the way that cases run dry when there is nothing physical to trace. No scene, no blood, no wreckage, just a man who walked out of a parking lot and into silence. Cecily Marsh put her dark hair up every day of that first year because it felt wrong to wear it down. She came to Sycamore Lane every Sunday morning and sat with Loretta and drank coffee. They did not talk about Dale much. They just sat. Gerald Stamper kept a photograph of Dale Voss on the corner of his desk for the rest of his career. His colleagues never mentioned it. They didn't need to. By 1995, 6 years had passed since Dale walked down Sycamore Lane for the last time. Cecily had eventually moved to Lexington. She sent Loretta a card every October 11th without fail, a single card, usually a photograph of something from nature, a hillside, a creek, and always the same 4 words inside, "Still thinking of him." Loretta kept every one in a shoebox on the closet shelf. Pam, Dale's sister, had married and had a son she named Raymond, after their father, which Loretta understood without either of them saying so. The house on Sycamore Lane had been repainted twice by then. The front porch screen had been replaced. The same front window looked out at the same lane, and every evening Loretta stood at it for a while. Neighbors who had known her since the 60s would sometimes see her there from the street. They didn't wave. They understood the window was not about them. In 1993, Harlan County had widened Eastover Road as part of a state highway project, and during the excavation of the verge near the VFW lot, a construction crew had unearthed a small grouping of items buried in the soft dirt behind the arbor vitae. A metal thermos, a lunch pail, corroded but identifiable. A man's leather wallet, empty, the initials DV stamped in the lower corner. The items were logged, photographed, and submitted to the county evidence office. They were connected to the Dale Voss case file, based on the initials. Gerald Stamper drove out to look at the site himself. He stood in the widened road and looked at the arbor vitae and looked at the distance from the VFW lot to the road and thought about Hector Blanton's blue truck, idling, engine running, nobody visible. He requested a warrant to search the property records of every blue pickup registered in Harlan County between 1985 and 1990. There were 63 of them. The list was compiled, but never fully cross-referenced. 3 months into the effort, Gerald Stamper suffered a heart attack and was placed on medical leave. He recovered, but he retired the following spring, and the cross-reference died on a deputy's desk somewhere in the shuffle. The wallet and the thermos and the lunch pail sat in evidence. The case sat with them. By 2000, 11 years had passed. Loretta Voss was 63 years old. She still worked part-time at the county clerk's office, where she had worked since 1972. Her colleagues there had known Dale since he was a child. They did not bring him up, but they did not need to, because Loretta carried him in the particular way that mothers carry sons they have lost, not as a subject, but as a presence, a weight that had become so familiar it was no longer distinguishable from the person herself. The arbor vitae at the VFW lot had been removed during the road widening. The lot itself was paved and restriped. The VFW held fish fries there on the third Friday of the month, and on those evenings the lot filled with pickup trucks, and nobody stood at the edge of the gravel and thought about what had happened in that exact spot in 1989. By 2010, Hector Blanton had passed away. Gerald Stamper had passed away. 3 of the 5 witnesses from the original investigation were gone. The world that had known Dale Voss as a living person was becoming a smaller and smaller circle. Loretta was still at the window. Before we go any further, every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together lives that deserved more than what they got. If this is the kind of story you believe ought to be told, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Loretta and Dale. In the spring of 2019, the Kentucky State Police launched a cold case initiative under a new evidence review protocol, assigning a team of 2 investigators to re-examine unsolved cases from the preceding 40 years. One of the 2 investigators assigned to the Eastern Kentucky caseload was a woman named Detective Iris Farley, who had spent 12 years with the state police and had a reputation among her colleagues for reading old evidence logs the way other people read novels, slowly, looking for the thing that wasn't supposed to be there. She pulled the Dale Voss file in August of 2019, 30 years after he disappeared. She noted the wallet, the thermos, the lunch pail. She noted the unfinished cross-reference of blue pickup registrations. She noted Hector Blanton's testimony about the idling truck and the way it had been recorded, but never fully pursued. She noted that the VFW lot had been accessed that afternoon by members who signed a log, a practice the VFW had maintained since 1981 because of a prior incident involving vandalism, and that the log for October 11, 1989, had been collected and filed in the original investigation, but never fully analyzed. The log listed 9 names. Iris Farley ran all 9. 8 of them were unremarkable: retirees, minors, a county employee, a man who had since moved to Tennessee. The 9th name was a man named Curtis Doyle, who had been 41 years old in 1989 and had operated a small equipment salvage business on the edge of town. He had a blue 1987 Chevrolet pickup registered to his business address. He had no criminal record in Kentucky. He had, however, been questioned in 1991 in connection with a different matter in neighboring Bell County, a complaint filed by a former employee who alleged that Doyle had threatened him over a salary dispute. The complaint had been dropped. But the Bell County report mentioned, as a background detail, that Doyle had been seen driving erratically near the county line on the evening of October 11, 1989. Nobody had ever connected that date to Dale Voss. Iris Farley sat with that for a long time. She read it again. Then she drove to Harlan. The wallet had been in evidence for 26 years. The thermos had never been tested for DNA. The technology available in 1993 would not have yielded usable results from a corroded exterior surface, but by 2019 it was a different calculation entirely. She submitted the thermos to the KSP Forensic Lab on a Tuesday in September. She called Loretta Voss that same afternoon. She told her she was looking at Dale's case. She asked if Loretta still had anything from that time, any item of Dale's that could provide a comparative DNA profile. Loretta went to the closet shelf. She came back to the phone with the shoebox. Underneath Cecily's cards, all 30 of them, every October 11th, there was a small brown envelope. Inside the envelope was a single strand of dark hair, which Loretta had kept from Dale's hairbrush the morning after he disappeared, the morning she had gone into his room to look for something of him and had stood there holding the brush for a long time before removing one hair from the bristles with her fingers and placing it in the envelope. She had kept it for 30 years. She did not know why exactly, except that it was his. It was something of him that she could hold. It was enough. The forensic lab confirmed a DNA match between the thermos and Dale Voss's hair sample on November 14, 2019. That established the thermos as Dale's beyond any scientific doubt and placed the burial site within yards of where Hector Blanton had seen the idling blue truck on the afternoon of October 11, 1989. Iris Farley began building the case around Curtis Doyle. His blue Chevrolet pickup had been sold in 1991, but vehicle records confirmed the sale and the color. A former neighbor, contacted in November 2019, recalled seeing Doyle's truck parked along Eastover Road the afternoon of October 11th, a detail she had never been asked about because no one had ever come to ask. She remembered it because Doyle often bought salvage equipment from the mine operation and would sometimes park near the road to flag workers as they left shift. She had not thought it was unusual at the time. It was not unusual. That was exactly the problem. Doyle had been there, where Dale would have walked, doing something unremarkable enough that 30 years of neighbors had never mentioned it. Curtis Doyle was 69 years old in 2019. He was living in a retirement community outside of Corbin, Kentucky, 50 miles from Harlan. He still drove, a sedan now, dark blue out of apparent habit. He had outlived 2 wives. He attended church on Sundays. By every visible measure, he had lived an ordinary life. On December 3, 2019, Iris Farley and 2 Harlan County deputies drove to the retirement community and knocked on the door of Unit 14C at 7 o'clock in the morning. Doyle answered in a cardigan. He looked at their badges. He looked at Farley's face. He said, "I wondered when somebody was going to come." That sentence was later entered into the court record. It was all he said before being advised of his rights. The arrest appeared on the front page of the Harlan Daily Enterprise. 2 days later, people who had known Dale Voss, people who were old enough to remember, sat with their morning coffee and read the name Curtis Doyle and tried to put together how a man they recognized, who had been at the same church fish fries, who had bought equipment from men they worked beside, had carried this with him for 30 years without anyone seeing it. That is the particular horror of a case like this. Not that the monster was a stranger. The monster was never a stranger. Curtis Doyle entered a guilty plea in March of 2021, the delay driven partly by pandemic-related court closures and partly by the methodical assembly of a case that had to be built almost entirely from physical evidence, much of it 3 decades old. As part of the plea, he provided a full account of what had happened on October 11, 1989. Court documents confirm that Dale Voss had refused an approach Doyle made near the VFW lot, a theft scheme that Doyle had been running using mine workers as unwitting intermediaries, and that Dale had apparently become suspicious of. Dale had told him he was going to report it. That was enough for Doyle. He was sentenced to 25 years. Given his age, the judge noted, the sentence was effectively a life sentence. Doyle did not respond when the sentence was read. He stood very still and looked at the table in front of him. Loretta Voss was 82 years old when the verdict was entered. She was sitting in the front row of the Harlan County Courthouse with Pam beside her, and Pam's son Raymond, 27 years old, named for his grandfather, on her other side. When the judge finished speaking, she reached over and took Pam's hand and held it. She did not say anything for a long time. That evening, she went home to the house on Sycamore Lane, and she stood at the front window, and she looked out at the road. The lane was empty. The street light at the corner threw the same shadow it always had. She stood there for a while, then she let the curtain fall. Iris Farley had called her before the sentencing to tell her what Doyle had said in his statement, that Dale had refused him, had stood his ground, had told him it was wrong. That was the last thing Dale Voss had done. He had stood at the edge of a gravel lot, with his paycheck in his pocket and his pot roast waiting at home, and he had told a man doing something wrong that he was going to report it. He was 22 years old. He was the best young technician Hollis Crace had ever trained. He sang baritone in the First Baptist Choir and kept a photograph of his mother tucked in his sun visor and called home every Sunday morning without fail. He was the kind of person a community is built on, and it took 30 years to say his name in a courtroom and have justice attached to it. Cecily Marsh drove to Harlan from Lexington the week after the sentencing. She and Loretta sat on the front porch with coffee and let the October air sit around them the way it had in so many Octobers before. Cecily brought the card she had written for that year's October 11th. She gave it to Loretta. Inside, in her careful teacher's hand, she had written 5 words instead of 4. Still thinking of him. Always. The house on Sycamore Lane has been in Loretta Voss's family for 60 years. The front window looks out at the lane, and the lane is quiet most evenings, and the streetlight throws its shadow across the pavement the same way it always has. Some things, the ones that matter most, don't look any different on the outside when they change on the inside. What Loretta let go of that evening was not Dale. She will carry Dale for the rest of her life. What she let go of was the waiting, the vigil. The 10,957 nights of looking at that road and needing to believe that the next pair of headlights might be his. She knew now, and knowing, even knowing the worst of it, was something she could live with, because it meant Dale was not gone without explanation. It meant someone had been made to say what they did. It meant that the man who came home every Sunday and ate her eggs and kissed her cheek and walked down the lane into an October evening was not simply taken. He was found, and he was named. That is what 30 years of watching a window will cost you. And what it can, if you are patient enough and the truth is stubborn enough, finally give you back. What do you think about the evidence that was there from the beginning? The VFW log, the blue truck, the neighbor who was never interviewed, and why it took 30 years for someone to connect it. Was this a failure of the original investigation or something else? And what does it say about the people who keep faith for decades? Loretta at her window, Cecily with her cards, Gerald Stamper with the photograph on his desk, that they held on that long. Justice found Dale Voss after 30 years. Stories like his are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe and check the description below for more cold cases that refuse to stay cold. Thank you for being here.